Hello everybody, it's Titanslayer here, bringing you some more helpful and informative Smite build tips and tricks. And today what we're going to be looking at is the concept and some examples of item synergy. Now, what exactly is item synergy? Well, basically what that means is there are certain items which can work well or work badly when combined with other stats and consequentially other items. Item synergy is in your builds trying to make sure that you make the most use of that. Hopefully that's clear. If not, it should become a lot clearer when we look at some examples, which we're going to do right now. A common mistake I see in builds, which is a mistake basically because of the concept of item synergy, is building kin size and crit in the same build. Now, why is that bad? I don't hear anyone ask, I'm talking to myself. But regardless, we'll find out. Kin size as an item, if we look at what it does, it's power and its attack speed, but the real clincher is the passive. On basic attack hits, you deal physical damage, not true damage, that's important, physical damage, so it's affected by protections, depending on the amount of health that the enemy has. Now, this firstly means that you shouldn't be building it early, because enemies don't have much health early game, so why build it? It's much better late game, when the enemies have leveled up, and when the enemies will often have HP items. But also, there are certain stats which benefit kin size if you have a decent amount of it in your build. And those stats are penetration, because it is physical damage, it is not true damage. That means it's affected by enemy protections, and therefore each single hit of kin size, passive, on a target, i.e. each time you hit an auto attack, will do more damage with this item passive, the lower protections the enemy effectively has, i.e. the more of them you are able to ignore or shred through penetration and protection reduction. So build pen with kins. If you don't, kins isn't going to do that much damage. Also, attack speed. If you have, say, 1 or 1.2 attack speed, putting out 1 or 1.2 auto attacks per second, then you're only going to be proccing this kin size passive a maximum of that regularly. If you have a decent amount of attack speed in your build, if you're looking at maybe 2 or approaching 2.5 near that cap, then you are going to be proccing this kin size passive a lot more often, and therefore getting a lot more damage out of it. So if you don't have much attack speed, if you don't have much pen, kin size is not going to do that much for you. That's another reason to build it later in your build, because that way you can get it after you have those stats in your build. And we're going to look now at crit, to show why you shouldn't build crit with kins. We have no attack speed, no attack speed, no attack speed, small amount of attack speed, small amount of attack speed that becomes a moderate amount of attack speed when you proc the Wind Demon passive. And on all 5 of them, no pen. So those stats that we know kin size really likes having, the attack speed, the pen, you get very little to none of that from whatever items you build in the crit tree. So kin size passive is not really going to benefit much from any of these crit items. The passive of kin size cannot crit. If you get a critical strike, while it will double your auto attack damage, it will not correspondingly double the kin size damage. Similarly, if you already have some crit and for some reason you were considering a kin size, there's still better items available. You could simply get more crit, or you could get lifesteal, because when your auto attacks do a lot of damage, as per crits, you will then get a lot of healing out of your lifesteal. Or you could get pen, or more pen, if you don't have any, or if you don't have enough already. There's always going to be better options than that kin size because of the synergy that kin size lacks with crit and the synergy that other items do have. That's why you'll see Devourer's Gauntlet a lot on crit builds, but you'll see it less on more ability-based hunter builds, because lifesteal on auto attacks and especially on crits is a lot stronger. So kin size and crit. Another example that I see a lot is seeing items that scale off your passive. I'll start again. items that scale off of your power, magical or physical, such as a Polynomicon. Again, if we look at the item and think about, just for a second, what it does and why you'd use it, using an ability, whether you hit that ability or not, gives your next basic attack bonus damage, and that bonus damage is entirely based on how much power you have. So if you're building this item early, you don't have much power. If you're building this in a build where you are fairly tanky and don't have much power, you're still not doing much with this Polynomicon passive. One thing I often see is gods like Ymir and gods like Cabrakan picking up a Polynomicon because it's good when you're building damage on those gods. It's not good when you're building tanky on those gods. Yes, they can apply the passive easily, because Cabrakan applies one of his abilities via an auto attack anyway, because they both have the heavy crowd control to set up that auto attack, but that doesn't matter when you're not doing much damage with the passive. You may as well pick up another item. If you want raw damage, you could go for something like a Soul Reaver, or you could go for an item that gives some defense, or a mix of defense and tankiness. Polynomicon, when you're tanky, doesn't do much, because when you're tanky, you don't have much power. So there's a couple of examples, and I hope that has helped introduce the concept of item synergy. What we're going to do now is go a little bit more in depth. We are going to look at some builds which I have pre-designed. We have 2 for hunters, 2 for mages, and 2 for assassins. The first for each class is deliberately made to be a bad build, so that we can explain why each of them has poor synergy and think what is bad with this item and why I should not be building it in this kind of situation. It's not that the items are bad, it's just synergy with the rest of the build. And then we go on to an example of a much better build with much better synergy, and we run through why it works. So we are going to start with our hunters. The particular hunter doesn't matter. I've just gone for some of the first ones alphabetically, so that they're on the front page of each class. This is not to say this is a build that's good or bad on this particular god, it's just looking at the build as a whole. And as you can see, I promised a bad build, I deliver a bad build. We start with the Ninja Tabby, which attack speed is fine on hunters, but you don't tend to want to get Ninja Tabby very first item, because there's not much point in attack speed when each auto attack doesn't do much damage. It's better to have the power from Warrior Tabby for your wave clear on the scale and your abilities, or just for the higher damage per auto. 20 power early in the game is a lot, and that is the difference between Ninja Tabby and Warrior Tabby. So straight up here, we've just got this doesn't fit in well with the fact that we are currently early in the game. And we continue that trend with Deathbringer. Deathbringer is a good item on hunters if you're building a crit build, there's no doubt about that. But not here, because, again, we don't have the power. We have 20 here, we have 40 here, we only have 60 power. Each individual auto attack is not going to hit very hard, so yeah, okay, we're doubling it sometimes, because of course crit is RNG based. All prayer is RNGesus, he giveth and he taketh away. But each crit, even when you get a crit, isn't going to be doing that much damage, because we don't have the power and we don't have the pen for it to really achieve anything. So rushing a Deathbringer here, not only does the crit not really help much, but it's also very, very expensive. Deathbringer along with Malice, I believe. Yep, they are the two most, both at 3,000, and that makes them the 2 most expensive offensive physical items in the game. In fact, I think they might now be the joint most expensive items in the game, along with Rod of Tutti. So you're spending a lot of gold, slowing down the rest of your build, and the item doesn't even work at this point in the build. It doesn't work well with only having Ninja Tabby, and it doesn't work well with the fact that we are early game. Poor synergy. And we continue that theme here with Odysseus Bow, another item which has a passive that scales off your power, or to be more precise, scales off your basic attack power, but that in itself scales off of your physical power, 100% scaling on physical auto attacks. So we don't have much power yet, because Ninja Tabby doesn't give much power, Deathbringer only gives 40, we don't have any penetration, and also Odysseus Bow and crit is similar to Kin size, and crit. Odysseus Bow has no power to make your crits hit harder, although you will crit more often. You want the crits to hit hard when they do as well. And Odysseus Bow passive itself, much like Kinsai's passive, cannot crit. So poor synergy on both counts there, and we don't have the power either to make it worth it. Now, Executioner, this actually fine. I've just thrown this in to kind of progress the build along. The start of the build is still bad, but Executioner is always a very fine item on auto-attack based hunter builds. But then we move on to Jotun's Wrath, and this is an item that just doesn't fit with what the build seems to be trying to do, because we have our attack speed boots, auto-attack based. We have our crit, auto-attack based. We have our Odysseus Bow, auto-attack based. We have our Executioner, auto-attack based. All of a sudden, power pen cooldown. Very much an ability based item, so we've gone for all these auto-attack based items, and suddenly, later in the build, which is when hunter abilities tend to fall off and their hunter abilities tend to fall off and their auto-attacks tend to really come online, do we have an ability based item. So again, that just doesn't really work with the rest of the build. It's got poor synergy with the fact that we have a very auto-attack based build so far. And finally, we have a Kinsai's. We've been through this already. Kinsai's does not have good synergy with crit, so the fact that we have crit and Deathbringer in the same build is a poor choice. The fact that we are picking our last item and leaving ourselves with Deathbringer as our only crit item. You're not going to be critting consistently because you only have 25% crit chance, and that means you are not getting much benefit out of crit. And we also have another auto-attack based item with our ability based item. The main problem there is the Jotun's Wrath and the Deathbringer, really. Kinsai's works well with Executioner because attack speed and protection shred. It works well with Odysseus Bow because a lot of attack speed. It just doesn't work with Deathbringer. It doesn't really work with the Jotuns, and building it when we have crit leaves ourselves without enough crit. So as we can see, kind of from start to finish pretty much, that build was a bit of a mess. It doesn't really know if it wants to be crit or tank shred or ability based or whatever. So that is an example of a hunter build with very poor synergy throughout, and as a result is a very weak build. We're going to move on to something now much stronger and go through why it's a lot better. So again, it doesn't matter that we are Anher here. This is just to show the build. It's not to show what to build on this god. Now, we have a, not a starter item, but something to start with as well. Shown here, our Tier 2 Transcendence, which is a fine start, and then after that, we can go straight into our boots for that power spike, for that mobility. If you don't understand why getting boots and getting them early is very important, I would go for a bit of shameless self-promotion and suggest that you check out my top 5 build tips for beginners video. Go into detail on the importance of boots there, along with a few other handy tips. But moving back to what is in this video, we finish our boots and then we go into our stacking item. That's a good power spike. It gives us all the mana that we need if we find ourselves a bit mana hungry, and we get stacking, so we get our stacks finished reasonably early. And moving on, we have a Crusher. Now, what we have so far is a good amount of power, a very good amount of power. So clearly this build so far is a bit more ability-based and a bit less auto-attack based, because if we wanted auto-attack based we might have gone for a Devourer's Gauntlet here, focused more on the auto-attacks with the lifesteal and focused more on getting to that late game with it being not as strong and taking longer to stack. But once you've got it stacked, it's better for your auto-attacks. So then Crusher works well with that, because it does help us a bit with auto-attacks, its power and its pen and its attack speed. It's a great item, and it's also a bit of bonus damage on abilities. So if we look at these first 3 items here, good power, bit of power and a bit of pen, but also some attack speed, works really well on high ability damage hunters such as Neith, such as Medusa, such as Ulla. But then what we're doing for this particular build is moving towards a more auto-attack based kind of transition. And we have that started with the attack speed from Crusher. We're going to continue it with an Azzy, We have a lot of power already, especially thanks to our boots and Transcendence and a bit from Crusher. So now we get some attack speed, and we get some pen, and we get some lifesteal for those auto attacks. It's a cheap item, it gives good, well-rounded stats, and the fact that it doesn't give any power doesn't matter at this point, because we have a lot of power already. If we've built Azzy straight after our boots or something, we'd have been very lacking in power. But now that we're later in the build, it fits a lot better with the rest of the build, it synergizes well with what we have, because attack speed was one of the main things that the build was lacking. Lifesteal was something that the build was lacking should you want it, so it fits well with what we have so far. We're going to continue that auto-attack based transition with an Executioner. So we're getting some more attack speed, we're getting some more power, and we're getting that percentage protection shred. So we have our flat pen, we have our flat pen, we have our effectively percentage pen, our percentage protection reduction. So we're going to have good damage against our squishies, the enemy squishies, thanks to the high power and flat pen that we have with these first three items, and the flat pen there on our fourth. And now we have some tank shredding capability here, which is what hunters really excel at in the late game compared to other classes. And we're going to round it off, perhaps unsurprisingly, with, given what we were talking about earlier, with a kin size. Now, we know from earlier that kin size benefits from two particular stats: attack speed and penetration. Attack speed, attack speed, attack speed, penetration, penetration, penetration. Kin size in this build is going to add a huge amount of damage, especially against the enemy tanks, especially when you consider that we're reducing the enemy protections by a percentage amount, so it's better against tanks, and kin size has a higher percent health on the passive, the more health the enemy has. So we're really going to shred tanks a lot with these two builds here, with these two items here, and it fits really well with the rest of the build being high power and burst early, but moving into that auto attack based shred late game, without making our abilities too weak if we're a god where we want them to hit reasonably hard, because we still have a good amount of power and a good amount of pen thanks to the start of our build. So this, as a build, as we can see, the items synergize a lot better with each other, they synergize a lot better with what the build is kind of trying to do by starting that high burst early and moving into more auto attack based late game, and that's why the build as a whole, when we break it down, is much stronger. And as I'm sure a lot of you will have done, you can immediately look at that build and go, yeah, I see that, that is a much better build than this thing. So, we are going to move on, and we're going to do something similar with our mages. Again, it doesn't matter that it's Hera here, it's just she's first in the list, so I picked her. We're just looking at the items. Now, cooldown boots early is fine if you're a god that wants your abilities up a bit more often and you like that mana. Cooldown boots or pen boots, either is fine, really, depending on the god you're playing. But then we go straight into a soul gem. That is another item, like Polynomicon, that has a passive which scales off your power. But we don't have much power yet. We've only got the bit from our boots and the bit from our soul gem. I think about 120 power overall. Soul gem passive is only 30%, I believe. So yeah, every 4 abilities that builds up your stacks, and on the 5th ability you consume the stacks. So you've got the passive proccing for 36 once every 5 abilities. That's very, very low. And that's why we're not getting much out of Soul Gem at this point, and that's why at this point in the build, even though Soul Gem can be a good item overall, it's not here, because it just doesn't fit, it doesn't work, it doesn't bring enough to make the item worthwhile picking up, because the base stats themselves are pretty mediocre. They're certainly not good enough to make up for how weak the passive is. We see a very similar story moving on to Book of the Dead here. We get 100 power and 200 mana, and we get the passive, which is a shield based on the total amount of mana we have. We have a bit of mana here, we have no mana here, we have a bit of mana here, and also we're only 3 items into the build. So we're not that far into the game, we're not going to have leveled up that much and built up that mana pool that you get for leveling up. So you're not getting much out of Book of the Dead passive at this point in the game. The shield is going to be quite small, the base stats are very mediocre. For example, it's 30 power and 100 mana less than a Soul Reaver, and Soul Reaver also gets bonus damage on the passive, so it's just not giving enough benefit to make this item worth picking up. And then we move on to an item that you don't see as much, it's not that strong an item, but just to illustrate the poor synergy continuing, a Dynasty Plate Helm. We're going to bring this item up because it's not used as much, it won't be as well known. It is a bit of power, a bit of protection, and a bit of penetration. So it's a bruiser item, and it's cheap. It's sort of a tier 2, like Ichabod, like Doom Orb. It's the sort of item you would build earlier on to try and cement a lead on a bruiser mage. You've got that bit of damage and a bit of you've got that damage via a bit of power and a bit of penetration, and you also have a bit of protection for that survivability. So at this point in the game, we're getting a bit later into the build, so why are we buying an early game bridge item? And again, it gives no mana for our Book of the Dead passive. It gives no power for our very little power, sorry, for our Soul Gem passive. So again, it doesn't fit with the point in the build that we're at, and it also doesn't fit with the items that we have so far. Moving on further, we get a Polynomicon. We still don't have that much power. We've got maybe 55, 120, 220. We're looking somewhere in the region of 350 power at the moment, so it's starting to ramp up, but that's still not a huge amount, given we only have 10 flat pen as well. Polynomicon passive is magical damage, it's not true damage, so we're still not going to be getting a huge amount out of this Polynomicon passive that we have here. So again, it's still not worth picking it up, because the base stats on it are very mediocre. It's a pretty below par amount of power, it's a pretty low amount of lifesteal, and yeah, okay, it's a bit of mana, but you're not getting much out of this item by building it, given the build we have so far. And finally, Shaman's Ring. We have a build so far that just doesn't have that much damage. We've got boots, we've got a low power item here, we've got a low power item here, we've got a lowish power item here, we've got a moderate power item here, and we've only got 10 pen. We're not going to be doing much damage with this build because it's a pretty poor build so far. So Shaman's Ring, an item where the passive, once you damage an enemy with an ability, all future damage you do within the next 5 seconds is 10% higher. It's an extra 10% of not a lot. So again, there's no real reason to pick this item up here. The power and the movement speed is reasonable, so the base stats are pretty good, but again, you're not getting enough out of the passive to make this item worth it. Now, even if we perhaps take these items out, because the problem with these is that they were built far too early, we move them towards the end of the build, we still don't have much mana for Book of the Dead. We still don't have much power for Soul Gem, so even if we avoid the problem that we had of building them early, this is still not a good build. These were still not good items to pick. We can move on to a much better build, and that is stored under Agni. But again, it doesn't matter which god we are, it's just about the build, which again, you might immediately look and go, yeah, that looks like a much better build. And we're going to have a peek into why. So again, we have a pretty solid start. The tier 2 Book of Thoth is a pretty strong start at the moment. It gives a good amount of power for that early wave clear, and some mana as well. And then we can not stack that immediately, but go into our boots. Again, we know the importance of boots, that's fine. And pen boots, again, pen boots, cooldown boots, depends on the god, either is pretty decent, that's fine. Moving on to then Book of Thoth to get it stacked. So we have a bit of pen, and we have a very high amount of power. Once we get that item stacked, you get a lot of mana, and it converts mana into power, and that conversion increases once you get it fully stacked. As we can see here, the last sentence, at 75 stacks this item evolves, gaining 2% extra mana to power conversion. So you get all that mana from the stacks, you get some mana from leveling up, and you get a lot of power from the passive as a result. So getting it early to get those stacks quickly, that's fine, that's good. Then we can move on to A bit more of a flex item here, but a solid example that you can throw in is a Chronos Pendant. We have a bit of pen already, we have a lot of power already. There is not that much wrong with a mage, depending on the mage, wanting to have their abilities up more often, and Chronos Pendant achieves that admirably, especially if you have a strong teamfight ultimate, because of the passive on Chronos Pendant reducing your cooldowns even further by 1 second every 10 seconds. So we have pen and a lot of power, and then we get our abilities more often as well. This is a pretty solid power curve for the early to mid game, because we have a good amount of everything that a mage would want, and it all fits well together. Our abilities are hitting hard, and our abilities are hitting often. And that continues with our pen item here. I've picked Spear of the Magus, but this could be a Divine Rune if you need anti-heal, it could be a Spear of Desolation if you're against a not very tanky enemy team, it could be an Obsidian Shard if you're against a very tanky enemy team and you want that percent pen. But basically you want more pen at roughly this point in the build, so we have it. So we will continue to have that benefit of our abilities hitting hard and hitting often, Spear of the Magus being the one you'd pick up on mages with a lot of tick or multi-hit damage, such as, actually, Agni. His passive does trigger this item, that's often an underrated part. But also, Anubis, Raijin, Poseidon, good users of Spear of the Magus. But that's beside the point. Moving on to the last two items of the build, and we're going to talk about these two together for a reason. They both give good power and they both give a bit of mana, which works very well with Book of Thoth passive. Similarly, Book of Thoth works rather well with Book of the Dead, because we have a huge amount of mana here. We have quite a lot of mana here, we have a good bit of mana here. That adds up to a lot of mana for the shields that you get on your Book of the Dead. So, building Book of the Dead that late in the game, building Book of the Dead when you have a lot of mana from your other items, that is when the passive becomes really, really potent. Also, we have all the power that these items give to Book of Thoth with the mana, as well as having a decent amount of power themselves. So these particular three items are the book build, essentially, as it's commonly known. There's a reason that this is a very common kind of triplet of items that you'll see in high damage mage builds together, because you get a huge amount of power, you get a lot of extra damage with Soul Reaver passive, and you get that survivability with Book of the Dead passive without having to sacrifice much damage in the process. But there's a bit more to it than this, and that's when you look at the Soul Reaver. Soul Reaver passive is magical damage. It used to be true damage, it got changed. Now, instead of being true damage every 30 or 40 seconds, I don't remember exactly what it used to be, it's a reduced amount of damage, and it's magical damage instead of true damage, so it is affected by protections. Now, we have our penetration with our boots, and our pen item here could have been whatever here. So we have a decent amount of pen to make our Soul Reaver do quite a lot of damage. We also have the cooldown from Chronos Pendant to allow us to hit our Soul Reaver often, because it's on every damaging ability that we hit, and on every god that it hits in the process as well. If you have big AoE damage, you're going to get more procs of Soul Reaver because you're going to hit multiple enemies at once. So we're hitting hard with Soul Reaver passive because of our pen, we're hitting often with Soul Reaver passive because of our cooldown, and we have the book build trifecta as well. So that is what pulls all of this together to be a very, very well synergized build, and a very strong build as a result. We are going to move on to our final class for today. We're not going to look at tanks, because tank builds generally are a lot more situational, a lot more about counter building the enemy team, and a lot less synergy is present in defensive stats, really, apart from things like effective health. We're going to look at tank builds and counter building in another video. So, for now, moving on to our assassins, if I can stay on the right page. And again, it doesn't matter who we're looking at, it just happened to be I stored the build under Wheelix. And here we have another bad build. That's where we're starting off, as per the ones so far. We have our boots, which is fine, but immediately into Heartseeker. Now, Heartseeker, much like the Soul Gem example from earlier, scales off your physical power. We don't have much power yet. Now, there was a point at which this was actually a reasonably strong start, and that was just because Heartseeker was a very, very strong item. It was a bit overtuned and it got nerfed. Since then, the passive does less damage, it's lower scaling, and also, since the item got moved to the Transcendence Hydra's Lament tree instead of where it used to be, it no longer gives movement speed, which of course is a very strong stat on assassins because they like getting around quickly. So Heartseeker is not as strong as it used to be, so now this starting build is pretty weak because you're not going to get much out of Heartseeker passive. You'd be a lot better off with something like a Crusher that would proc on every damaging ability, rather than just one ability every 5 auto attacks. Then we move into a Void Shield, which continues to not give us the power that we need for this Heartseeker passive. Void Shield is a very good item on assassins at the moment. It effectively gives penetration via the aura of protection reduction, and it gives a little bit of power, and it gives defense and health, so it's a good balance between tankiness and damage. We'll see this item pop up again later in the good assassin build. But then moving on to Stone-Cutting Sword. So we've got mostly a sort of ability-based build here. And then we're going for an auto-attack item. Now if you look at Stone-Cutting Sword with Heartseeker, you're generally initiating with your abilities as an assassin, because it's your mobility, because it's your crowd control, because it's both, whatever. So you're going to proc this Heartseeker passive, having built it up on minions or buff camps or whatever, before you apply the protection reduction of Stone-Cutting passive. So that is reducing the effectiveness overall because you're not getting the full use out of Stone-Cutting passive due to proccing a chunk of your damage, Heartseeker, beforehand. That's why Stone-Cutting isn't that good on ability-based assassins, even if you're auto-attack cancelling, because by the time you've fully built up Stone-Cutting passive, or partly built it up, most of your combo is going to be finished. But then we move on to see a crit item thrown into the mix, which there is no reason for this to be here. We're an ability-based sort of auto-attack, but high pen build so far. We don't really have that much power to make crit worth it, but also it just doesn't really fit with the build. Most assassins don't use crit anyway, and it's just not many situations in which you'd want this at all. Then moving on to the final item, which is Titan's Bane. Now, not only does this leave us with only one crit item, which means we have a low and unreliable crit chance, but also this doesn't work particularly well with the Void Shield Stone-Cutting combo. Titan's Bane does penetration, based on the amount of protections that the enemy has. Now, if you're reducing the enemy protections here and here, you might take an enemy that has 150 protections and reduce it down to 100, or that has 100 protections and reduce it down to 50. Now, the amount of pen you get from Titan's Bane as a result is quite substantially decreased when you're reducing the enemy protections by that much. It's not always a bad idea to build Titan's Bane and protection reduction together. Just Void Shield for protection reduction and Titan's Bane for percentage pen. That's fine if you want to be a slightly tankier assassin and also do good damage to the enemy tanks. That can work reasonably well. But Void Shield and Stone-Cutting to then follow it up with a Titan's Bane, you're not really going to be getting that much use out of that Titan's Bane because you're reducing the enemy protections so much here. And so that's why that doesn't really work. So as we can see, that's why the build ended up a bit of a mess. We're going to jump across a couple of gods now to look at what should be a much better example. And you'll see already that you might see this sort of thing quite commonly in your games. Assuming Conquest, you'd start the Attacker's Blessing and a tier 1 of the Mage tree for that immediate 15 power for your buff camp clear. Any other modes, this could often be an Attacker's Blessing because it gives a lot of power for a starter item and evolves very quickly to give 10 penetration. That is a huge damage spike. So Attacker's Blessing, very, very strong in the modes where it's available. Then we move into our boots, because boots and power boots, because we're looking here at a bursty assassin kind of build, and we continue that trend with a Jotun's Wrath. It's power, pen, cooldown, and a bit of mana. So this is all about accentuating our ability damage, so bear that in mind as we look at the rest of the items. We continue that with a Crusher. It's power and it's pen, which is good. The attack speed, yeah, it can be okay. It speeds up your camp clear a little bit. If you've got good crowd control on your assassin, you're going to get a couple more auto attacks in, potentially, thanks to that. But mostly it's about the power, the pen, and that bonus burst damage that you get. So we're continuing the ability-based theme here. Now, a very common thing on assassins at the moment is to, once you've got a decent bit of damage online, make them a bit tanky, because assassins do have to typically get into the middle of fights. They'll often have a lot of mobility to get in and then get out again, especially if you have Blink as a relic. That's an extra mobility option, but still an assassin can potentially be locked down pretty easily, so a bit of defense such as a Void Shield is very common. As we mentioned in the other build, Void Shield is a very good item. You get a bit of power, but you get defense and health, and you get actually quite a lot of extra damage, thanks to the passive of reducing your enemy protections by 20 flat. That is effectively 20 flat penetration. So that's a big boost to your damage, and you also get a good amount of tankiness for when you're diving in, hitting your abilities and trying to get out again. We continue that kind of theme and cover one of our weaknesses so far, which is magical defense, with an Anchile or Anseal, or however it is that you pronounce it. We get the power. Still, every item we have so far has power, so we're not sacrificing a huge amount of damage, but we've covered both sides of the defense spectrum at this point. We have a bit more cooldown to continue our theme of an ability-based build, and we have a potentially very strong passive in that silence when you take magical damage. If we find Anchile, we can't see it because it's already in the build, but we can find its tree. You get the silence when you take magical damage from an enemy ability. So if you are diving in on a mage and they are trying to counter-engage on you by comboing you, you can interrupt that combo, you can prevent them using their escapes if they have one. That even prevents them from using relics such as Aegis, although you can still use beads when silenced, because the whole point of beads is to get yourself out of crowd control. So very, very strong for engaging on enemy mages and not being engaged on in the process, as well as having that bruiser, divey, ability-based theme in the build that we have so far. So that fits really, really well with the fact that we are high ability damage with some survivability. And that is rounded off with a Masamune. We have a decent amount of penetration so far in the build already, so unless the enemy team is particularly tanky, we don't need to worry too much about that. We have pen, and we have a passive which is effectively pen. So now Masamune is just a very solid all-round bruiser item. You get a good amount of power, 50, that's pretty decent. You get a bit of movement speed, you get a bit of health, and you get a bit of protections via the passive. You get those protections via the passive more strongly, you get more of them in a team fight, which tends to happen more later in the game. So this item just kind of gives a bit of everything and fits in with what we have in the build so far, in getting around, in cooldown for engaging and disengaging and doing your damage, getting in and out with a bit of tankiness, a bit of movement speed, and still a decent amount of damage. So it's very, very clear what this build wants to do, and that it does it well, because we have the damage, we have the tankiness, we have the cooldown, we have the mobility. This is a solid all-round bruiser assassin build, because it just fits really well. All the items fit well together. That is not to say this is the perfect build, this is not to say this is a go-to all the time build. You might want a Mage Cloak because of heavy enemy crowd control and all that sort of thing, but that's all counter building, that will come another time. This illustrates the concept of item synergy and why this sort of build works very well. And that will be it for today. I apologise that this has perhaps dragged on a little longer than either of us were hoping it to. I'm sure you've listened to me more than long enough at this point, but I hope everyone has a wonderful Christmas period, whether you celebrate the festivity itself or not. Thank you ever so much for listening to my ramblings. If you found this helpful, if you found this interesting, don't forget to drop the video a like, give the channel a subscribe. It really helps me spread this channel to more people, really develop interest and help as many people as I can. And if there's anything you'd like me to cover in future videos, just let me know in the comment section down below. I will catch you all in the next video. For now, Titan Slayer